First of all, Len, congratulations. This is just a terrific book. It's always magical and wondrous moment to see these books appear after hearing in conversations with you over several years the amount of incredible work that you put into this. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Steve. And in a way, it's a follow-up to the wonderful film you made, The New Barbarianism. And it's been great to work with you, and I'm great to talk to you today.
So before we begin, some quick thanks to the many staff that helped make this all possible. On the Global Health Policy Center, Mackenzie Burke, Michaela Simoneau, Michael Rendelman, Sam Shivers, and Uma Govindamwe. From our production team, Dinesh Matani, Margaret Rogers, Chris Barnett. Special thanks to all of them. Also, just as a plug here, the book is available from Columbia University Press. If you care to order it online, they're offering a 20% reduction off the list price if you just use the code CUP20. Is that correct, Len?
That's correct.
Did I get that correct? This is the culmination. This work is the culmination of decades of work. Len served for 14 years, 96 to 2010, as president of the Physicians for Human Rights. And as he recounts in this book, it sort of threw him in the deep end in terms of international affairs, violence, and the health sector. He'd been a domestic advocate largely before that. And this was occurring in a decade in which lots of these issues were playing out in many different conflicts that he details with remarkable insights and depth in the course of this book. We haven't really had a scholar like Len that brought to the task of this phenomenon of violence emerging in so many different settings, across so many different disordered and conflicting settings, with different logics driving them and the like, with this sort of continuity and longevity and extraordinary commitment and perseverance. He has built, as you go through this book, he's built up a remarkable community of allies and partners in this across an incredible spectrum of settings, people that he's drawn on systematically to make his case and to understand what is happening. We first intersected when you were at PHR, Physicians for Human Rights, and then, as you mentioned, in putting together the documentary film, The New Barbarianism, which we issued in 2017, we turned to Len, and he features very prominently in that, both for you to contribute substantively in that, but also in your guidance and pointing us towards many of the other people that we brought to that. He's not just a scholar, he's also an activist pioneer. As you'll see in this book, and we'll talk about, he forged the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition. That became a very powerful and important factor in driving debate over what WHO should be doing in data collection and driving the deliberations over the UN Security Council, well, particularly Resolution 2286, in deliberations over what should be put in the National Defense Authorization Act in terms of the U.S. Department of Defense and the like. So at many different points, direct dialogue with former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Len was really at the table and pulling the coalition together and organizing them around what are the points of all of this. In the book, there's several tensions, and we'll talk about those. There's one tension which comes through loud and clear, which is a sense of resignation and cynicism and defeat that has grown around this field versus a continued call for resilience and hope. There has been recent progress, much of it stirred by Len's activism. There's been a mobilization of new interests, yet there's been very limited progress, and we'll talk more about that. There's also a core tension around, is this a new normal, this level of violence? Or is this something that has greater continuity historically in the tension, as you laid out, between the humanity vision of Henri Dunant versus a sort of pragmatic military necessity that you associate with Francis Lieber. You know, when we look at the changing nature of warfare, you're sort of pushing us to think again, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Syria or counterterrorism or the technological changes and the media changes that are associated with war and violence. One of the things I find very refreshing about this also is that you put a big focus on examining ourselves, examining the United States' own actions both as a leader but also as a culprit in this narrative that you're painting. We can talk a little bit, I think, towards the end about Afghanistan and some of what has been put forward in some of the recent writings. Anand Gopal's piece in the New Yorker, for instance. You've created an analytic framework in this book, which we'll hear more about, in terms of trying to understand the different logics that come into play in driving people to use violence against the health sector. And you put a very, very, very heavy focus on norms as still a central factor in trying to think through how we cope with this. So Len, congratulations. As a long-winded intro, we're going to have a conversation here. We're going to ask some of the experts that are in our audience after we've gotten into the conversation for a bit to please join us. There's a microphone here. We would welcome you coming forward and offering your own thoughts, comments, questions directed to Len. So Len, let's start with a personal note. Why and how did you jump into this and make this the central passion of your life over the last couple of decades?
Well, thanks again, Steve, for having me. As so much that happens in life, it's a lot of serendipity is involved, and I got a job to run the NGO Physicians for Human Rights in 1996, and my predecessor, Eric Stover, had written a report with many others on the assaults on healthcare in the war in former Yugoslavia. And we decided to release the report in Sarajevo, so I went for the first time, and I saw the results of the assaults. The fact that the major hospital in Sarajevo was still full of pockmarks from shells, many, that its windows were still covered with kind of UNHCR blue sheeting, not glass. And I heard the stories, and there's one story that completely kind of overwhelmed me, where a very courageous pediatrician working in a pediatric hospital in Sarajevo was assured that the hospital wouldn't be attacked, but it was. And she was in a neonatal ward with about 20 babies in incubators, and the shelling started, and they felt they had to leave. They went to a hospital next door. Shortly after they left, their unit was destroyed, but the electricity and water was also knocked out in the hospital next door, and 9 of the babies died. She herself ended up being injured in a blast that hit her home. So it was just very moving to me, and so shocking, because we all know for 150 years the Geneva Conventions have protected healthcare in war. And in the years subsequent to that, I was involved in investigations in Kosovo and Chechnya, in the West Bank and Gaza and other places. And the one takeaway I had from these reports that we kept cranking out was we kept documenting these violations, but no one much was paying attention. And it was at a time also when global health was rising to the top of the international agenda. There was all kinds of ferment about protecting people who are stuck in war, the responsibility to protect the development of the International Criminal Court, and yet this issue was nowhere. And the WHO occasionally issued some antiseptic statements about these issues, but didn't do anything. And this went on and on and on. And it was...
How did you explain that to yourself in terms of the indifference or the reluctance or the hesitation to take this issue up at that point?
I just thought that it just was so low on the agenda, and there was not sufficient noise about it. that it didn't reach people who needed to act on it. Basically, it was a matter that human rights reports kept coming out, but they didn't really make an impact. And I distinctly remember, this is not in the book, but when an investigator who did work in Chechnya testified at a congressional hearing. And it was like, we're concerned about our relationship with Russia. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
So there just wasn't the kind of solidarity. The medical community wasn't involved. Public health community wasn't involved. The global health community wasn't involved. Some human rights organizations were involved. But it just didn't rise, as many issues hadn't risen to the agenda.
But you brought a certain rigor and determination to try and break that indifference and paralysis. And so what was the strategy that you brought to it?
Well, that didn't happen until 2010.
Yeah.
And a number of things happened at the same time. By total coincidence, the International Committee of the Red Cross decided to start their own campaign around 2010, 2011.
This is the Healthcare in Danger?
Yeah, Healthcare in Danger. At the same time, I had written an article about findings, a review of the history. And at the end of the article, I said, well, someone ought to do something about this. In particular, WHO ought to collect data, and we ought to do these other things to promote accountability. So that coincided with the ICRC, and that led to starting the coalition and starting to lobby at the UN and WHO and working with the ICRC. So it was a coincidence, and that got the ball rolling.
But you had ready partners. I mean, you had folks at ICRC. You had some friendly governments that were willing to come and talk to you, right? You found a coalition forming in that period,
yes,
right?
Yes, we did. A number of NGOs. And the U.S. government was very supportive, particularly on the WHO initiative to collect data on the problem. And Norway and some other states were really interested and were willing to support the work. And then that started the ball rolling. And then in this seminal event, when the Kunduz hospital by MSF was bombed, and it was front page news all over the world.
This was October 15?
Right, 15, this is 5 years later. That catapulted the issue onto the Security Council agenda. So there were a lot of things that happened, and we can't, as advocates, we know people are always taking credit for all the wonderful things they do, but a lot of things came together. There were a lot of things that happened in the world that pushed the agenda forward.
Why was the bombing by the bombing by the U.S. military was a mistaken bombing in Kunduz of the MSF hospital? 44 people killed, including quite a number of patients and staff. A profoundly traumatizing event for MSF. But why was that so catalytic in your view?
Oh, there were a couple of reasons. Number one, it was the first time in decades that the U.S. military actually bombed a functioning hospital on purpose. Now, it was on purpose, even though there were many mistakes. They didn't want to target the hospital, but they ended up going after the building, and we don't have to go into all the mistakes that led to that. It was also the only major trauma hospital in northern Afghanistan. It served thousands of people a year. It was very modern, very effective. MSF was very proud of it, and it hadn't been going for that many years. And the destruction was so horrific that, you know, the idea that you'd bomb this hospital, it made the front page of the New York Times like a week running. Right. Obama had to apologize. MSF decided to start its own campaign about it, and they used all their resources to bring it about. So that was a catalytic event, and that, combined with all the groundwork that the ICRC and the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition had done, helped really put it on the Security Council agenda.
So let's skip ahead a little bit in terms of the book. For this audience and for people who may not have read it, who are going to the book, what are the 3 top-line messages that you want to convey to the audience, that you're trying to bring across here?
One is, this is not new. Mostly, when you look at the history closely, you can see violations going back in wars, going back to the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Mozambique, El Salvador, you name it. So this has been a constant, and the idea is the new normal is only considered the case because we tend not to have any historical memory, and there's been no data collection in the past.
So there is no golden age.
No golden age. A second, and this is one of the things I kind of discovered in my research, is that while the Geneva Conventions are about the most widely accepted international treaty involving any kind of human rights, where almost every country is ratified, everybody expresses fealty to them, no one openly says it's okay to attack healthcare. In fact, there's a subterranean set of norms that is operative, and I try to tease out in the book. And paradoxically, that goes back to the same time that Henri Dunant was writing, when Francis Lieber, who wrote the code for the Union Army in the Civil War, had a completely different theory of justifying harm against civilians based on military necessity.
So your second point is that, let's not be mistaken, there's not just international humanitarian law as embodied by the Geneva Conventions. There's a code or doctrine or norm of military necessity.
Yes, except that you could say that Dunant won in the law. The law reflects the principle of humanity and rejects Lieber's logic. But the reason I said subterranean is that I think that militaries act, for example, to attack hospitals for strategic reasons or tactical reasons, or because it's convenient, or it's inconvenient to comply with the precautions they're required to take. And you see this articulated sometimes, and sometimes it is revealed in behavior. And I guess the third point is that despite going on the agendas we just talked about, starting with the Security Council resolution in 2016 and a lot of commitments made at that time, there's been paralysis ever since. There hasn't been action on the resolution. Governments have just continued to express rhetoric in support of it without doing anything. And yet, there are things that we can do. There are ways and examples of means of either stimulating restraints or imposing restraints and accountability on the perpetrators. So I guess that's the third message.
Okay. So you posit that, you know, the reality is you have this tension between the sort of military necessity versus the Geneva Conventions, that there's a subterranean logic that is driving things. How does this impact U.S. policy? I mean, the pattern, what's the pattern of U.S. policy and approaches in your view? How would you characterize it given this framework that you've put together?
As in so many other areas, the United States is on every conceivable side of the issue. It is a staunch defender of the Geneva Conventions, and if you read the Law of War manual, it continually cited and is fealty to it, and you can't speak about U.S. policy without recognizing that. It's also been a leader, as I said, at WHO in stimulating the documentation of attacks. But there's a big but. Take the case of Yemen. Within a couple of months, the beginning of that war in 2015, it was very clear that the Saudis were not taking the requirements to be careful in their targeting, avoid hospitals and civilian installations, and people were being killed all over the place. And our colleague Larry Lewis went to Saudi Arabia, try to help them, but it was clear at the highest levels that they didn't care. And the administration knew this. And yet, the administration from the start vastly ramped up military support to the Saudis, including not only ordnance like bombs, but mid-air refueling, which allowed planes to fly around looking for targets and relying on rather badly trained spotters, not checking no bomb list, the deconfliction list it's called. And this was known and known and known. And yet the military support continued. And there's a lot of hand-wringing about it. Rob Malley and Steve Pomper, who are at the NSC, have written since that we got into a car with a reckless driver and never got out. Same thing with the British, that they continued to support military assistance for people who were committing war crimes well after the time the war crimes were obvious to the world. So that's another example.
This is one of your arguments in the book, that our relationship with proxies, with partners, is perhaps the most difficult zone, right? Is that fair?
Yes, and that's reflected too in the interpretations of the Geneva Conventions, where there's a duty not only to respect the conventions, but to ensure respect. And the U.S. has always taken the narrowest possible interpretation of that duty, that it only applies to its own soldiers. The ICRC and many others have said it applies to at least proxy forces or partner forces, and perhaps beyond that. But the U.S. has rejected that for years. And at the same time, yet in another realm, it's remarkable how in key moments in recent years, we, the United States, have invoked military necessity as though Lieber's views applied not to conventions. And that happened in Raqqa, where the city was leveled in the fight against ISIS, and U.S. and its allies bombed the major hospital, even though it's still full of patients. Now that hospital is being misused as a machine gun nest, but still you're supposed to take precautions. And you mentioned Leonard Gopal. He did an amazing assessment of that. And at the same time, General Mattis cited military necessity in the Battle of Raqqa. So we see these contradictory views toward the protection of healthcare in many, many different places in U.S. policy.
So while we're on the topic of U.S. policy, Kunduz still remains a point of reference. We now have the end of Afghanistan, and we have pieces like Anand Gopal's description of what has happened in the countryside in terms of warlord partners abusing communities, attacking health facilities for extreme levels of violence over many, many years with no accountability. And then we're seeing, as the war ends, folks in the countryside not terribly disappointed to see the departure of the U.S. military, but no accountability.
Yes, and certainly in this area, there's been no healthcare. There's been no accountability. And there was an investigation, a forced investigation, basically, in Kunduz, and some people were disciplined, but there were no war crimes or criminal negligence charges brought against any of the people. And not only that, here's another example. The U.S. government was, through the CIA, has been complicit, or was complicit, in these terrible night raids conducted by Afghan security forces, the special forces. And they invaded homes, they killed people at hospitals, and the CIA won't discuss it, no investigations, no accountability. So that's another example. But I do have to say, there are other areas in Afghanistan, going back to your prior question, where the U.S. showed amazing leadership. It was really the first country to put into play rules for hospital searches, which are so common and so violent. General Rick Gross, who was a legal advisor to the commander in Afghanistan, basically set very strict rules. But that was back in 2011, and over time, they waned.
Can you explain what you mean by there are different logics to violence against the health sector? You have 5 categories of logic, 4 of which fall under your military necessity. Can you explain to us what does that mean in practice? Give us some examples of how you differentiate this, because you're saying this is not just one big blob of violence. It has a rational purpose to it that differs by context, and we need to understand, your basic argument is we need to understand that there's at least 5 different logics that come into play, sometimes in combination with one another.
Yes. Yeah, that is kind of what I hope is the kind of analysis that will stimulate some conversations about whether I'm right, whether this is a good framework. But it starts with the proposition that attacks on healthcare may be similar to attacks on civilians and also attacks on humanitarian aid workers, but they're also different. And when I looked at the different contexts, I saw what seemed to be different logics. The first one is strategic. That is, you're attacking healthcare to achieve a military objective. And then Exhibit A is Syria. It's impossible to believe that 600 hospitals have been attacked, almost all of them by the Assad regime, other than for purposes like displacing populations, taking over territory, trying to sever the population from armed groups who were in control, and the relentlessness of those attacks over 10 years and the evidence of where they took place, usually in conjunction with particular battles, shows, I think, that it's strategic.
So
That's
in
the
strategic case, the attacks become part of the war strategy.
Yes, and we saw it in a different way in Myanmar, back in the eastern provinces, that 50-year war in eastern Myanmar against the government, where their strategy was forcible displacement of the population as part of the so-called Four Cuts strategy, and attacks on both village health clinics and these itinerant backpack health workers who served them were part of the strategy. That's the first one.
Okay.
Second one is tactical. Tactical means in the moment it helps. It could mean taking medical supplies out of a medical facility, out of a clinic. It could mean kidnapping staff to have them serve your own cadres. And it could mean demanding priority for your wounded, when the conventions say you can't force others to give your people priority except on medical grounds. So all these in the moment kind of incidents, they ramp up. They're very, it really occurs very frequently, and people don't think that there's some rules that should prevent them from doing that because it's so logical.
Yeah.
So that's the second. The third is indiscriminate attacks. And that's Saudi Arabia for one, but it's certainly not the only one. And it took a struggle over 100 years, from 1864, from the first Geneva Convention, to 1977, to outlaw indiscriminate attacks after the horrors of the Korean War, of strategic bombing in World War II, Vietnam, and the use of napalm and cluster bombs, to say you can't indiscriminately bomb. In Korea, roughly, people estimate that 1,000 hospitals were destroyed in that indiscriminate bombing, but it still takes place. So it's a failure to follow rules and precautions. So that's really critical. It happens, there are other examples where, and by the way, that's also a matter of indifference. It's indifference to the rules. And we see this in Israeli conduct toward Palestinian medical evacuations, where there are ways, and this gets to urban combat and asymmetrical warfare, there are ways of safely allowing the Palestinians to get wounded people into ambulance and through checkpoints. But although Israeli conduct has been checkered over the years, they, in recent years, have been fairly indifferent to the kinds of precautions they ought to take. So I've kind of mixed up two of the failure to take precautions and the indiscriminate. So those are really two different ones.
Okay. All right. What can you point to as major successes in recent times? What do you see as, I mean, it's a pretty dark picture that you draw in this book in terms of the continued frustration, pessimism, and the like. But what do you point to as instances of success?
I'm just hesitating over the word major. But there have been successes.
Let's just say success.
There have been some successes in various ways. And I'll point first to a very odd success that is really counterintuitive. It involves the Taliban. The Taliban, as we know, want to take over governance of the country, which they now have. And over the last 10 years or so, part of their effort was to have to win over the population, win over hearts and minds in the same way that NATO forces wanted to win over hearts and minds, and healthcare was part of that. And they even developed in their code of conduct, which they have, they said you should not attack healthcare. And while they didn't comply with Geneva Convention's rules, like if there was a military installation next door to a hospital, they had no compunction about destroying the hospital in the same sense as they attacked the military object. But they were sensitive to criticism. And the UN Human Rights Agency in Afghanistan kept putting out reports on civilian casualties and kept calling out the Taliban for its coercion, for its failure to comply. And they would always respond. Who would have thought that they would feel it necessary to respond to a human rights report from the UN? And it did affect their conduct. Now, it was far from perfect. I mentioned one example. They also used coercion and often closed clinics if they didn't get their way in terms of services. But you could see that the dynamic between the negotiations that ICRC and MSF had with the Taliban, some NGO health providers had with them in the role of elders, and this pressure from the UN Human Rights Agency, I am convinced affected their conduct. So that's kind of an example, an unexpected example. And I'll go back to Israel. I was there during the second Intifada in 2002, and when I went, we went because they had killed 6 medics in 2 weeks as fighting started in the West Bank. And there was a major outcry about this, both within the military and from human rights groups. And that resulted in a change of practice. And starting by mid to late 2002, Palestinian medics stopped being killed, and medical evacuation proceeded safely. And unfortunately, it dissipated over time. But it does show that you have successes, maybe not cosmic successes, but successes nonetheless.
Thank you. We have a number of terrific experts here with us in the audience who've kindly come over to CSIS this morning. I want to invite you all to come over to the microphone if you wish and pose some questions. And if you feel inclined to do that, just identify yourself, offer some remarks and questions. So I want to ask you, while we're waiting for that, tell us, you close your book with an appeal for new leadership. You end on a positive note in the sense of being very honest and candid about the frustrations and the limits of progress up to now. But you lay out some things that should be the agenda for the future. Among them, your closing point about we need new forms of leadership. What does that mean? What do you really have in mind? Where would you point to?
I would point in two different directions. One, leadership by governments and militaries to fulfill commitments they have made. They made these commitments in that resolution we've talked about, but they haven't implemented it. They haven't taken steps. And some people have to step forward to say, we are going to do this. And I think there are opportunities there, and I think once people become more aware of the problem, that's a possibility. The second is we still have a long way to go within the health community, the public health community, nursing, medicine, global health. There can be solidarity and there can be leadership. For example, ministers of health have basically played a passive role in this problem. But there are some terrific examples in Colombia and the Central African Republic where the ministers are owning this issue. They're supporting health workers, they're negotiating with armed groups, they're putting out guidance, they're raising their voices, and in some cases, acting with great personal courage. And the question is, why haven't we convened these health ministers from all over the world in a series of discussions of how can we support each other? How can we address this problem? What should we do? So I think there's potential because we have great examples.
Do you see instances of country leaders stepping forward now?
Well, I mentioned
you mentioned a few, but on the horizon, are there movements that you see, changes that you see that you would be paying greatest attention to?
I do. I mean, places you might not think about, Sudan in the new government. So yes, as well as the two I mentioned. And we could name others, but not off the top of my head. But yes, I think there's great potential. And
what about new international capacities? I mean, what more needs to be done at WHO? What more needs to be done in the coalition? What more needs to be done at ICRC? Or when you look at the institutions that have some sway over this particular issue, who've made some new commitments, what more?
Right. If you ask WHO, they would tell you that they are very committed to this issue. The Director General speaks about this publicly. But there is a problem at WHO, not only in this area, but many others, even COVID, where the organization is still so beholden to member states that it's very shy and reticent about being very aggressive on this issue. And I think there's more political space for being more assertive. And without it, it's going to follow a path that will show interest but not results.
Thank you. Mike? Please identify yourself and...
May I remove?
Welcome. Yes, please.
Michael Barnett, George Washington University. This has been a terrific talk, so thank you. I'm interested in, I guess, two questions then. One is the relationship between international and local healthcare workers, because it seems that there's a greater global outcry when it's MSF that's being bombed. They've got international celebrity status. They've got the microphone. But when there's local healthcare workers that are being attacked, there's not nearly as much. And so I'm wondering what that relationship is, and do international agencies, medical emergency organizations, have a special responsibility then to make their lend their voices when local healthcare workers are also being attacked, and find ways to collaborate? The second is this question of compliance with international humanitarian law. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility of compliance without firm sanctions. and more than name and shame, which is sort of what you suggested with the Taliban. But are there other mechanisms, maybe domestic, maybe with congressional opposition to the White House when it comes to, let's say, providing arms supplies to Saudi Arabia? What are the different ways in which we can find enforcement for compliance with these laws?
Thanks, Michael.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you for your help and advice on the book. I really appreciate it. On the first question about indigenous health workers, those people are the majority of health workers, by far, majority of health workers in conflicts. And that goes way, way beyond the local staff of international organizations. And they're also the primary victims. And as we know, discussions of the problem of violations of Geneva Conventions tend to focus on aid workers, humanitarian aid workers, and we're always trying to get health workers who are not humanitarian aid workers into the mix and protection. But you're absolutely right. They have been neglected. Even though they're the primary victims. And in Syria, almost 1,000 have been killed. And many humanitarian organizations tend to focus on their own staff, or they collect information and they don't share it. That's a big problem for a whole lot of reasons. So we do need them to step up as well, and it's beginning to happen. It is beginning to happen where the ICRC always talks, for example, how local health workers are the primary victims. And the second question about accountability, that is, of course, the biggest elephant in the room. We have the International Criminal Court. There's been complete paralysis at the Security Council to refer cases like this. There have been attempts to refer Syria to the ICC, but it's always vetoed. Other mechanisms have been sabotaged politically. For example, the Saudis succeeded in keeping themselves off the list of persistent perpetrators of violations against children because they threatened to withhold humanitarian aid. So we get deeply into politics when we talk about accountability. On the other hand, this is no different than any other area of human rights. And again, leadership makes a huge difference. Sometimes political courage, sometimes not very much political courage. I don't think it would have taken a lot of political courage to stop selling arms to the Saudis and make sure that others who sold arms were held accountable diplomatically. That's possible, but it has to happen.
Len, Michael's questions point us also to something we haven't talked about much, which is the role of U.S. Congress in this. What is your thought? I mean, Congress became very active on Yemen and the Saudi role.
Yes, and that's another success I didn't mention before, that both in the UK and here, it was a citizen movement that got the legislature to act. And as you know, Congress voted multiple times to cut off funding for the Saudis. Trump vetoed those bills, but Congress played a really important role on arms sales. Also, for the first time, back in December, you mentioned this in the introduction, that it passed an amendment to the defense bill that says that the Defense Department has to say what it's doing in its operational procedures to protect healthcare in military operations. And in the past, it's always said, we tell everybody to abide by the Geneva Conventions, and they left it at that. And this could be a stimulus to have these kinds of reviews. So that's a good role for Congress.
Larry Lewis, thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this event, and Len, thank you so much for the contribution in the book and for your enduring contribution. I'm convinced that a theory of change for fixing this and similar kinds of problems, we need to have a deep underlying understanding of the factors that lead to these problems, and also the kind of the culture that leads to to an environment that makes these problems harder to solve. So I'd like to build on your subterranean norms point, which I think is just right on key, and I really don't see this discussed very much. But in my work in civilian harm overall, I see this a lot too. So as you say, there's a lot of talking points about the commitment to international law and the Geneva Conventions, but then, and I will also say, you see, as you pointed out, like General Gross's efforts, and there are others, kind of operational things that are being done that are best practices. But then you also look at the larger landscape, and those things tend to not stick. Just like Kunduz, there was an investigation, and they said they took it seriously, but what really has changed? And so, and I ascribe that to your point of the subterranean norms. I think of it as like this undercurrent that pulls us in the other direction, that is kind of based on the principles of the Lieber Code, that sharp wars will get us what we need, and so effects on civilians, effects on civilian objects, they're kind of seconded to the strategic objectives, and of course rocket is a shining example of where that can lead. So my question to you is, if we have these subterranean norms, if we have this undercurrent that pulls us in the opposite direction, that makes it so hard for us to actually make progress, what can we do? What can that? I mean, so we seems like we have a favorable administration towards these values. We have a Congress that seems more willing to be engaged. What are your thoughts on what they could do for that underlying problem that seems to limit progress?
That is a great and hard question, and I just want the audience to know that in the book I talk about Larry's work to try to control Saudi conduct in Yemen, but he got very little support from within his own government on that, and the Saudis weren't really interested in the end. First of all, on the question about the norms, I think we have to start by calling it out. They're subterranean in that they're not recognized. Occasionally you'll see someone talk about it. Paul Ney, the general counsel of DOD in the last administration, actually cited Lieber and the need to win a just war quickly, which was Lieber's idea, in justifying attacks against terrorists in urban areas. So, and that was completely contrary to the Geneva Conventions, and except in a few blogs, he kind of got away with it. General counsel of the whole department. So we have to start by calling it out and making it closer to the surface. And then we can look for the leadership to say, let's confront this problem. It's a major issue. And part of what I tried to do in the book is help bring it to the surface.
Thank you, Larry. Adam?
Adam Richards, George Washington University. Len, thanks so much. Thanks to CSIS for hosting this. And thanks for mentioning the 4 cuts, which I was planning to ask about in my question before that. I wanted to really appreciate your use of history, and then think about maybe some hopeful vision for the future based on my recent personal experience. If there's a subterranean view, I wonder if there might be something more, though, where there's sometimes an explicit endorsement of different policies. I find, to your question of is the framework useful? I think it's useful, if only to think about maybe how the U.S. has been involved. So I think if you check off the 4 different categories, you can find examples. You mentioned, Yemen, maybe Kunduz, right? In thinking, about draining the swamp and the 4 cuts, these are food funds, recruits, and information policy of the Tatmadaw. I mean, that looks strikingly similar to what was in fact taught, was it not? In certain schools run by the United States. In Georgia, I'm wondering, to some extent, if some of your research brought you into that world where actually we have been maybe under the table disseminating some of these strategies as fairly explicit. To be a little bit more hopeful, perhaps, so I recently moved here from Los Angeles, and I have a second grader and a fourth grader, and so we went out to Dulles to the Air and Space Museum, and sort of looming over our entire visit, right, is the biggest airplane there, and I knew what it was. The kids had no idea, and we saved it, the worst for last. The Enola Gay is sitting there as perhaps, the biggest example of one of your categories of just the expediency, the sharp war and whatnot. But, is there no more striking example, right, of the U.S. sort of failing to account for its role? I mean, I admit, I don't think about it in terms of healthcare, right? I think of just the general populations of those two cities that were destroyed. But it provides yet another, right, way for the U.S. to, think about that. Until the U.S. ends its exceptionalism, PHR won, right, shared the Nobel Prize for its work in landmines, and yet we have this exceptional position, one of very few countries, Can there be leadership, right, from the U.S., until we actually acknowledge that past? But, sorry, I lost the hopeful part there. So my second, fourth grade, they were so shocked, right? But you realize, like, by sharing the history and telling the story, which you've done, I haven't read the book yet, but I know you well enough to know it's done really well, and making others appreciate this horrific history. I think there's just a natural tendency, right, for the next generation to just be shocked and horrified. And if they're aware of it, they will be the ones, right, I think, to bring us out of this, horrible predicament. So thanks.
Thanks, Ed.
Well, I'll give you an example, a historical example for hope. You mentioned the Enola Gay. When the Geneva Conventions were modernized in 1949, and the ICRC sought to end indiscriminate or strategic bombing, the U.S. was staunchly opposed. One, because it didn't want any retrospective judgments on what it did in Dresden and in Japan with the atomic bomb. And two, it was the only atomic nuclear weapon possessor at the time and didn't want to be constrained about using nuclear weapons in the future. So it continued. And we saw that in Korea, where it destroyed 18 cities, killed more than 10% of the population in the bombing. Vietnam, but largely because of Vietnam as well as other factors, the law changed in 1977. It said no indiscriminate attacks. And since then, while there are exceptions, the U.S. has largely complied. When we talk about bombing in Afghanistan, for example, a lot of civilians have been killed, hundreds, thousands maybe, but not hundreds of thousands, not 500,000, not 1 million. And that's because the military does not believe anymore that it is permitted to engage in that kind of behavior. So that is a source of hope. And can I make one totally unrelated point?
Of course.
I forgot. I realized when on the 4 logics, I left out the very first one, which has had a profound impact, which is that the conventions say you treat enemies and your own soldiers the same, only based on medical criteria. But there has always been resistance to that in the field by many different militaries and combatants, armed groups, conventional militaries. And that is reflected not only in practice, but in contemporary counterterrorism law, where U.S. law says you may not provide medical care to a terrorist. It's considered material support, which is as contrary to the Geneva Conventions as possible. So that's not an item of hope, but it's something we need to focus on because it's another way in which the values of the conventions are being undermined by the value of fighting terrorism.
Len, this has been an extraordinary conversation, and I think I speak on behalf of everybody who's here that, we're both here to celebrate and congratulate you on this book. We're also here to sort of register our gratitude to you for the diligence, the leadership, the creativity that you've brought to this really important topic, the intellectual contributions you've made, the activism that's resulted in all sorts of actions happening that might not otherwise have happened. So you've really brought a leadership with many dimensions to it over many years, and we're really seeing this, and it's a terribly important issue. So I want to just thank you for that, and I want to thank Mike Barnett and Larry Lewis and Adam Richards for coming forward and helping us stir this conversation, and for all of our staff. Did you care to offer a comment?
I just have a question.
Come on forward. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Hi, Len. Eliana Monteforte from Global Health Council. It's great to meet you in person in this virtual world we find ourselves in. Global Health Council does a lot of advocacy with civil society organizations, and many of them advocate to protect health workers, particularly in times of emergency. And while, COVID-19 might not be considered warfare, I mean, a lot of human rights violations around health workers has come up in so many different ways around the world. And just maybe in closing, what would you tell civil society organizations and communities that will be reading your book, and how they can advocate to really make a difference? What kind of bottom-up approaches do you think could really make a difference?
It's a great question, and of course the Global Health Council does terrific work here and around the world. And I would say get engaged. There's been a lot of work at the global level on this issue, but very little at the national level. And there is tremendous space for civil society groups, women's groups, health groups, professional groups, to do more work domestically. And we've seen in Nigeria, for example, that has had some success with changing laws about how gunshot wounds are handled. And so there are opportunities, and there's tremendous space for that. So I'd like to thank you, Steve, for hosting this. And as people have heard, those who have spoken here not only ask great questions, but have helped educate me. So I'm greatly appreciative of all of you and the many people, including Steve, who have taught me so much about this issue. And in a way, the book is nothing more than my reflecting on what I learned from everybody else.
Thank you, Len. Thank you, Eliana, for being with us. Thank you.